Yes. Oh, this is for you. Okay. Okay. You've never had a filter? Listen. I've never had one either. I just bought one. That's it? Is that it?
I think David. Yeah. So that's perfect. That's that right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open it up now, ladies and gentlemen, to the floor. If you have any particular questions that you'd like to address to Steve before he has to leave us in 10 minutes or so, I encourage you to get those in now. A couple of ground rules to encourage discussion and interactivity. I would very much encourage you to phrase your questions in the form of a question and try to avoid the dreaded words, "My question is really more of a comment." If you speak for a long time, I will cut you off, I'm afraid, in order that we can give everyone a chance to participate. Please identify yourselves. When you take the floor, please say your name, but also which organization you represent, so that everyone can have a sense of what perspective you're bringing to the conversation. And very simply, for those of you who aren't familiar with the system, if you would like to speak, please raise your microphone. And you will see a little button in front of you with a person speaking, and that will turn the light on, and that will tell us that you would like to take the floor. So with all that out there, would anyone like to address a question to any of our panelists? I see the lady in the green scarf and then the gentleman next to her.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers and everyone present today. My name is Joanna Meyer. I'm with the Trans-Africa Water Pipeline, and I'm interested in also the Great Green Wall, the Pan-African Great Green Wall. And so my question is, how do your agencies and the IRC cooperate with the Pan-African Great Green Wall project, which is a way to combat desertification? Thank you very much.
Could I just ask, whoever's mobile phone is playing the soothing music, if you could possibly silence it, that would be very much appreciated. Okay, please, sir. They've left. Well, try to think of it as a gentle harmony in the background of our discussions. Yes, the next question was from the gentleman there.
Can you hear me okay? I think my question is to Steve.
Sorry, could you please identify yourself?
Lawrence Freeman. I'm an economic development specialist for Africa, and I've been working with the Lake Chad Basin Commission for several years in the government of Nigeria on a water program called Transaqua. My question for Steve was, you mentioned, and I've heard you speak about this before, coupling development with these issues, but what kind of development are you referring to? From major infrastructure projects, small-scale development, dealing with the questions of the lake? Maybe you could help clarify that a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question in this round from the gentleman there with his hand raised.
Hi, my name is Charles Ichoku. I'm a professor at Howard University. And my question is to Paul. You said something related to forecast-based financing. Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you. I'm loving the concision of these questions, ladies and gentlemen. This is absolutely stellar. Steve, maybe if I can turn to you first.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to really drive the point of development needs home. There have been a lot of plans and projects, and actually I was frankly quite surprised the first time I saw the list of development projects that the Lake Chad Basin Commission had mobilized resources for in the early 2010s for big water management projects, and those are extremely important. One thing that has to continue and that the Lake Chad Basin Commission really needs to be in the lead on is the water management and land management, large-scale activities, project support, which involves building polters and dams, and also an awful lot of support in the terms of agricultural inputs and things like that. However, what I think is extremely, probably most important for us to do in the new way of working context, the thing that we mostly have in mind would be area-based or local development activities. As I was saying, there's really no experience of education facilities, no experience of health clinics, no doctors, no teachers, et cetera, no water treatment, and this needs to be brought in with our ongoing programming, and it can be done in a relatively modest budgetary scale. It really just fits in naturally with what we're doing already. On the government side, working with the governments in the region, I mean, we also really need to help them envision their way of establishing a social contract with these people and the communities. I think a lot of the analysis about the origin of the conflict comes back to this being an area where the people's really, it's one of the most remote parts of the world, frankly, when you get out onto the island communities, and so they've never had an experience of the government, and I think this is extremely important to help in terms of stabilizing and creating more secure conditions.
Thank you. Paul, can I maybe turn to you next to say a bit more about forecast-based financing?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Forecast-based financing is something that is in its infancy. I think many organizations are probably working on some form of it. In essence, what it does is it frees up money when you know a shock is coming. It could be a drought or a rainy season, a lean season, or things like that. If you know something is coming and you can take anticipatory action to mitigate the risks or avoid the risks, then having that money early in the response to prevent and mitigate rather than just respond to the actual shock could help reduce the shock and most importantly help the people that we're trying to serve. So very specifically what that means is it's not something that I can point to one project that has worked perfectly. I think that we're recognizing that this is the process that we need to learn from. So the key elements of the process are to really assess what are the risks. Like, it's easy to say there's a lean season coming, but what triggers that? You know, where exactly is that threshold? Agree on thresholds with the governments and the communities about what that thing would be, so that people understand it can be coming, and also have agreement among the partners that what those thresholds are. And then develop anticipatory actions before the event. So you can know, if we receive this funding, here's the type of project we can do that would mitigate that risk. And as I like to say, after all those steps, repeat, learn, and try again. Because this is clearly something that it's a great potential. We all like the idea and the sound of it, but getting it right, I think, is very context specific and really requires partnership, really good science, and a learning orientation. Right now, WFP is working on these mostly in the drought areas and also in areas that we expect flooding or storms. So Bangladesh, Nepal, flooding and storms, Mozambique, a bit of both, and obviously the Lake Chad Basin is anticipatory. I think this is a partnership endeavor. It's not something WFP is going to do by itself. We're going to do it with the governments, and a very important element of this is having a donor that will help pre-position funding for that purpose. And then it's on all of us together as a community to show the value of that pre-positioning of money. if you get this money, it really does reduce the risks. The community really can mitigate or anticipate or avoid those things. That's on us to prove those concepts, but I think the Lake Chad Basin is an area that really needs this and that we can work together on it.
Thank you, Paul. And I will just abuse the moderator's privilege again, if I may, to say that this is something that certainly DFID, the UK's development agency, is thinking a lot about, including with respect to the Lake Chad Basin. I think one of the earlier questions touched on this issue of water management. We can look at the surface water situation in Lake Chad, but also the question of how subsurface water and aquifers are managed, and really how we empower the local communities around the lake to manage those resources and to respond to those kind of shocks, particularly climate related, is hugely important. So one of the things that the UK is investing in terms of our development partnerships around the lake is in terms of how can we provide local communities with better meteorological data so that they can know when a drought is coming, so that they can look at when is the best time to plant, if there's going to be a lean season, or if there's going to be a season when fishing is going to be very difficult. How can those communities be helped to think about alternate ways of sustaining their development and their economies? And that maybe brings us to a question which I think was addressed to the whole panel, which was around water management, but then also desertification, forestry management, and how your agencies or your organisations are factoring that into your work. Would anyone like to take that one? Yep, Grant, please.
Yes, many thanks, Jane. So indeed, I mean, this is a Sahel-wide initiative, and when you look at what's happening to the Lake Chad Basin now, and you look at other locations, in the north of Mali, there are lakes which once upon a time were on the satellite imagery. They've just disappeared entirely. Our teams are discussing with the African Union, and from a UN point of view, apart from the World Bank, it's FAO and UNESCO that are in the lead of this initiative. But it indeed is, and I think interesting what you were saying, Carolyn, looking at those both dimensions, also the subsurface water, and this is going to be the stress is going to. There's a double stress factor here. There's the climate change, but then there's also the population growth in the Sahel belt. So the increased pressure on scarce resources is a major concern. So it's an extremely important initiative.
Did anyone else on the panel want to speak on this before we take some more questions?
I can a little bit. I mean, IRC has definitely not been, I think, is positioned on really wide-scale desertification efforts in terms of our environmental health or food security programs. We're a bit smaller scale. But even so, I think in some of those community initiatives, we've seen some work some progress being made on that. For most of our water sort of sanitation supply, we are just addressing overcrowded because of influxes of displaced populations in camps or host communities. So we're just trying to address sphere standards with new boreholes, bathing facilities, and latrines. But we are training up water management committees and linking them to local government resources so that they're generating user fees so that they can respond to needs as they come. So it's sort of building in some sustainability so that water access remains stable. And in some of our rural livelihoods work, we have farmer field schools where we're also trying to sort of build up the resources, which include some kind of early warning alerts for farmers that they can be better prepared to have improved harvests over the long term.
Thank you. And it strikes me that this is an issue that really gets to the heart of the complexity of the interplay between security, development, and humanitarian issues in this crisis. So many of you will know, for example, the dried fish trade was fundamental to a lot of communities around Lake Chad. That's no good to you if you can catch the fish, dry them, but then you can't sell them because Boko Haram, JAS, or ISWA are preventing you from getting to market, or they're taxing your catch. Similarly, if you are farming but you cannot get out of the garrison towns to get to your land in safety, that's a very difficult challenge to overcome. And as Richard was alluding to, there's no humanitarian solution to that. There's only a sticking plaster. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Yes, gentleman on the front row in the blue shirt. We have the microphone.
Thank you. John German, People to People International. Paul, thank you so much for mentioning forecast-based funding, which I hadn't heard that term before, but it strikes me as being very resonant with something I am working on, which is impact bonds. And interestingly, the moderator is from the country that did the world's first ever impact bond, which was done in the UK in 2010. They've been done in other countries, and over the next couple of days, if there's anybody who's interested in pursuing those, or if there's anyone on the panel who has any experience with them, I think we should pool our information and build the community of practice around them, and if possible, even have a working group to do promising projects. Thank you.
Could I, having said I wanted people to keep it to just questions, might I ask you to just say a few more words about what impact bonds are and how they would relate to this crisis?
Thank you. It was really a question, hoping someone on the panel would have something to add to that, but if not, we can build something. The idea is that as the chair of the Impact Investing group for the Nexus conference said in one of these conference rooms in 2016, the era of investing solely for financial return is over. And what this means is that there are lots of people who want something to happen which is not financial return, and impact bonds are a way to give it to them, either with or without some financial return attached. And all of the agencies on the panel are of the caliber to be able to do something that can show measurable performance against agreed upon metrics that would survive auditing by some independent third party to say they were real. And if that's the case, there are people who will invest in getting those metrics done. Whether or not they need financial return is a design question. Having designed preferred stocks for companies, I welcome this because designing an impact bond is very much like that. You could put together an impact bond that does anything.
Thank you. I see a question in the middle of the second row there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Yang Hong. I'm from Oklahoma, professor of hydrology and remote sensing. My question, first one is I'd like to your comments on how much the water, too much water like flooding, or too little water, drought, and also water quality problems like wash problems. Those I heard of terrorism, political system, but I'd like to know how much percentage-wise the water and water-related disasters cause problems in Lake Chad Basin. That's the first one. Second question is, I heard emergency response versus sustainable solution. So I'd like to know, what do you think about the capacity building in terms of the technology, economics? So that's my second question. Thank you.
Do we have one more on this round? Yes, the lady in the middle in the back row. Could we have the microphone there, please?
Thank you very much. I listened very critically to the overview of the situation in northeastern Nigeria. And I was worried.
I'm sorry, ma'am, could you say who you are?
Okay, so my name is Alice Ojo, Federal Minister of Water Resources, Nigeria. Thank you. I listened critically to the presentation of the overview. And the appropriation mentioned was $1.34 billion. And if you look at the implementation, the available resource, I was very keen for Nigerian allocation of $847 million. But on implementation, we have just about 29.2%. Please, my question is, what are the challenges in the implementation of the available resources towards these activities of humanitarian crisis in the country? Then secondly, the other one is the new way of working was mentioned that the immediate humanitarian needs reduce, that there is a need for reduction. How do we, the strategy for reducing the risk to the most vulnerable? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if the panel would like to address those questions. We had one around challenges of implementation in the response with the funding that's already available, and one around the importance of capacity building. Maybe we could come to those first, if any of the panelists would like to speak on that. Saw Grant nodding.
Yes, indeed. Many thanks. And I think one of the first of all on the low implementation, one of the key challenges we are facing, and it's more for certain interventions than others, is around the access. So this is I don't have a very specific response on the water piece, but indeed anything that's not let's say a flash intervention, where you have access difficulties, it's more the humanitarian type of interventions, which are much a shorter time intervention that is easier to realize. And especially when you're looking at anything to do with infrastructure, borehole maintenance, or looking at something like establishing some kind of a pipeline, this is more challenging in a constrained access environment. I think that the second question on the capacity building is indeed is extremely important in this region. I mean, we are seeing just very recently, we have seen the re-emergence of cases of cholera in certain areas. And this is something which we have seen in this region going back. It's a kind of a cyclical thing. And if we want to get out of the cholera, it really does require the water health and sanitation is the key part of that intervention. I do have some other points on some of the other interventions, but would you like me to carry on, or shall we leave it to the other panelists?
Why don't you carry on and then...
Yeah, I just wanted to say many thanks for the question also on the impact bonds. And this is something that we are in discussion with a number of some of the public donors are in two areas. One is around indeed water structural financing for water distribution projects on the one hand, and then the other is related on the treatment of malnutrition side. This does require a change in the way of doing business, and sometimes we can have many discussions over some time. We are also trying to learn from other actors who, as you say, may have moved into concrete. I mean, the International Committee of the Red Cross released the humanitarian bond. So we are trying to learn from those exercises, in terms of both the how to set it up piece, but then also how they are working in practice. But indeed, we would agree that there's a significant opportunity. So there are many different discussions going on in that area. Thank you, Over.
Thank you. I'll just give some of the other panelists an opportunity to intervene if they would like to on any of those questions before we take more. Yep, David.
No, I mean, just to say on the challenges to implementation, I mean, if a humanitarian aid convoy is attacked, as has been the case, and if aid workers are kidnapped or indeed killed, I mean, this clearly does have an impact on the community's ability to implement humanitarian operations in that area, at least for the short term, because inevitably humanitarian staff may withdraw until they can sort out the security challenges. And I think obviously this will leave communities without access to basic assistance. Maybe just on this on the sort of financing point, I mean, there is a thing in the UN called the SURF, which is, under the authority of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Central Emergency Response Fund, and it gives allocations to rapidly deteriorating situations under what we call the rapid response window, but also to underfunded situations. And I know, in line with this talk about kind of early financing, there's a lot of talk about this and internal discussion about how we can better cater for those sorts of needs. I mean, historically, it's been, disbursements to address issues such as locust intervention. If you have a locust outbreak and you eradicate them before the outbreak gets too severe, clearly you're going to save money. So in that case, you can clearly kind of make a link between early disbursement of financing for early action purposes and, the final result, and indeed saving money. And there's a lot of thought going into other interventions in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just give the floor to Amelia. I see your questions and we will come to them very shortly.
Yeah, just quickly on the sort of capacity building and the sort of long-term versus emergency response. I mean, as has already been mentioned, humanitarian organizations are often getting short-term 12-month funding, so there is limits to what we can do in terms of a long-term intervention, despite the fact that this crisis has become quite protracted. So we sort of run into a problem of we'll do lots of community building, but we don't always have the sort of next level local government. And in part, for example, like health services, local health staff have left these areas where humanitarians have stepped in. And so we don't necessarily have a chance to build the capacity yet because we are filling the gap. If there's an ambulance that's needed, it's a humanitarian ambulance that is transporting people. So I think that's a challenge we've seen. And again, it's related to the insecurity and the access of, in some of these harder to reach areas, the humanitarians have really stepped in to provide the services, and it becomes an issue of dependence on humanitarian aid. So I know that from the IRC's perspective, we're very much committed to building local partnerships. But in some cases, the access issue makes it quite a challenge.
Thank you. Just very brief to add on to that. I think that's a very good question you're asking. And I think that the humanitarian community is doing much better than they were 10 years ago on building capacity and through humanitarian projects and having actually developmental ends sometimes built in. So it's the way you do humanitarian can really bear fruit later. So I'll give a couple of examples. One is to make the assistance, when it's appropriate, conditional or linked to education or work activities. So you get the humanitarian need is met, but you're also getting a developmental aim, which can also have social cohesion effects. When you can see a refugee population working side by side with a displaced population or the host population, that can have a healing effect on, when it's done in the right kind of project, in the right kind of place. That can really have a healing effect. It could show that people are contributing to community assets. Another way is cash. The use of cash empowers beneficiaries when appropriate, when possible. Why not cash is something that DFID and others have asked many of us, and I think it's a good question to start with because that can be in the right context an empowering thing. Other things, vouchers. If not cash, well, you can choose those items you need from a selection, so you're getting the things you need and you're not getting the things you don't need. Local purchase when the market allows, that helps. And also doing humanitarian programs as much as possible with local actors. So instead of using expertise from Geneva or Nairobi or Rome or New York, we rely on local expertise, local universities or regional assets, regional expertise and local staff. That leaves behind something and helps the ministries later when they're responding have a local expertise that they can draw on.
Thank you. Professor Yang, I'm not sure any of us on the panel have the acute expertise that would be required to answer your question, but I'm very conscious you're covering this topic later on a panel, so I hope you'll forgive us if we don't know the exact answer. I see a question here. If we could have the microphone there, please. Yeah.
My question is river bloodiness.
I'm sorry, could you just...
I'm Gloria Kins, and I'm Diplomatic and Society Review. I'm a UN correspondent. I'm asking about river blindness, because what this gentleman said about designated funds and action, I believe the Indians, for some reason from India, and Indian doctors here are very involved with river blindness, and they will give in kind. And I'm just curious if your agency is working with those groups.
Thank you. And we have another question from the lady next to you. No? Oh, okay. Do we have any other questions from the floor at this stage? I see none. Would anyone like to comment on river blindness? Oh, please, if we could have the microphone back here, please.
Geographically ignorant, but I believe that the Congo has a lot of water that they could give to the rest of the Chad Basin, but also they have the threat of Ebola. Is this another danger? If they do have the water to give, would it be threatening because of Ebola?
Abuse my privilege and just say a word on that, because I also in a previous life worked on the 2014 to 16 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So Ebola is not waterborne. It's not contagious in that fashion. I think the question of diversion is something that might be revisited in the later panels. I would just observe from a personal point of view, from my experience in this region, that the Congo, it does have a lot of water. It suffers, as a lot of places across the world do, from there's a lot of water in the wrong places, which would be very costly and very inefficient to transport. I think also, as was touched on earlier by Grant, there would be a real question if we start talking about diversion projects, pipelines and so on, about creating things that would be extremely tempting targets for some of the insurgent groups operating in these regions. And I think, certainly speaking from a UK perspective, what DFID has been looking at with our partners is these climate-related pressures, water-related pressures and so on are unfortunately only going to continue in the short to medium term. The effects of climate change that are already being felt more harshly in the Sahel than in many regions where warming is going up by 1.5 degrees more than in the rest of the world. We can't necessarily tackle those climate-related pressures directly, but what we can do, I hope, is support communities to mitigate against their effects and the shocks that they bring. And so when we as the UK look at the situation around the Lake Chad Basin, we're less interested, I think, in questions of water diversion, irrigation, and more interested in how can we help those communities adapt in a changing future to the climate realities they face. But I don't know if any of our panelists would like to say anything on this. Grant?
No, yes, no, indeed. Just simply to completely agree on the Ebola point. I mean, that's absolutely we would see that as a kind of unrelated.
Just make one brief observation really about the linkage between the humanitarian and the development. What hasn't, I think, been discussed at all today is the initiative taken by a number of extremely generous states, including the US and Great Britain, at a high-level conference on the Lake Chad region, which raised in Germany at the end of last year $2.1 billion towards development and a whole raft of initiatives. I think the challenge really is to leverage those funds and the political and diplomatic leverage that goes with it into the humanitarian field more effectively. That is a tremendous, generous expression of solidarity by the international community. There are, on top of that, I think $400 million in concessionary loans. So we're talking about $2.5+ billion that have been committed to the Lake Chad region. Now, a lot of that goes towards safety and security and infrastructure, but perhaps more thought into how the humanitarian work can be leveraged more effectively and dovetail more effectively.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any other participants wishing to take the floor? I see none, in which case I will very briefly try and sum up this very rich and wide-ranging discussion. I think none of you will have been left in any doubt, if you were, about the scale and the urgency of the humanitarian and development needs in the Lake Chad Basin region. We've heard, naturally enough, because we have a distinguished panel of representatives from within the UN system and the international NGO community, about what international partners can do to help meet those needs. But I think what you've heard consistently from all of our panelists is the importance of nationally and locally owned and led solutions. Much as there is no humanitarian solution to a humanitarian problem, there is no international solution to this problem. There needs to be the political ownership at the community level, but also with the regional governments. And we've heard a little bit about how that is being implemented, including through the Lake Chad Basin Governors Forum and other regional mechanisms for response. I hope that over the next 2 days we'll have more opportunity to delve into how those locally and nationally led responses can be supported by the international community. It's a very long way from this conference room here in New York to the shores of Lake Chad, but the people, the women and children and the men of that region, it's very clear from what we've heard today, cannot wait for solutions to this crisis. And those will have to be solutions that tackle the complex and cross-cutting nature of the drivers as well as the symptoms of this crisis. We've heard about the difficulties in terms of humanitarian access arising from the security situation, but also the very difficult physical terrain of this region. We've heard about the toll that it's taking on communities that, as Grant has talked about very eloquently, we're at a baseline where the level of human development was already extremely low, where people who have been displaced, often multiple times, were already coming from communities where they had no access to the most basic of services. We've heard about the particular protection needs and vulnerabilities of specific groups of people, including women and children who, as ever, unfortunately, are bearing the hardest brunt of this crisis. And we've heard a bit about how some of the long-term pressures, such as demographic pressures, but also climate change, are adding further to the stresses on this region. So I would just, in closing, I think, hope that all of us here, the immense amount of expertise from a wide range of backgrounds gathered here, can really focus in over the next 2 days on what are some practical solutions that can be taken to these problems, and think about how the needs that can be met on the ground to these very difficult situations. So with that, I would thank very much our distinguished panelists. I've been asked to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that the afternoon session will begin at 3 p.m. sharp, so please do be here and in your seats by 3 p.m. Because of the extreme efficiency and effectiveness of our speakers, we were able to give you an early lunch break, so we will be breaking now until 3 p.m. And we look forward to seeing you in the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Can we get a photo for the press, please? Oh, yeah. Of the panel standing up, please. Dr. Ephraim, could you join them, please, let me get you the panel photo?
You should be in the middle, Ephraim.
Terry,